versus Pepsi. Picture this. It's the late 1800s in America. Horses are still the main way of getting around. Electricity is more of a fancy city trick than a household standard. And people are really into weird medicine. I mean really into it. Tonic this, elixir that. If it fizzed, tingled, or tasted like cough syrup, someone swore it could cure everything from headaches to heartbreak. It's in this world that our two cola rivals are born. The birth of Coca-Cola. Long before it became a global empire, Coca-Cola started out in a small pharmacy in Atlanta, Georgia, in the late 19th century. And the man behind it? A Confederate veteran turned pharmacist named Dr. John Stith Pemberton. Now, Pemberton wasn't your stereotypical titan of industry. He wasn't a ruthless businessman or a natural marketer. He was, in fact, more of a tinkerer, someone who loved experimenting with formulas in hopes of striking it rich. He also carried some heavy baggage, a crippling morphine addiction, which he developed after being wounded in the Civil War. That addiction drove much of his experimentation with new remedies. In 1886, Pemberton concocted a syrup that blended coca leaf extract. Yes, the same coca used in cocaine, though much weaker back then. Cola nut for caffeine, sugar, and a mix of flavorings. He took the syrup to Jacob's Pharmacy in Atlanta, where it was mixed with carbonated water and sold at the soda fountain for 5 cents a glass. The drink was advertised as a delicious and refreshing medicinal tonic that could relieve headaches, fatigue, and even impotence. Remember, this was the age when patent medicines were all the rage. People would drink just about anything if you promised it would cure something. Pemberton called his new product Coca-Cola, a name chosen by his bookkeeper, Frank Mason Robinson, who also designed the now iconic flowing script logo. That's right, the famous Coca-Cola font wasn't the work of a big advertising firm, but of an underpaid clerk with good penmanship. But here's the catch. While Pemberton had the recipe, he wasn't exactly a business genius. He struggled to promote the drink and was constantly short on money. His morphine addiction didn't help. He was desperate for cash to fund his habit, and soon he started selling stakes in his formula to investors. One of those investors was Asa Griggs Candler, an ambitious businessman with a sharp sense for marketing. Unlike Pemberton, Candler knew how to build a brand. Bit by bit, Candler bought out Pemberton and the other small stakeholders, eventually gaining complete control of the Coca-Cola formula and company by the early 1890s. Pemberton, sadly, never lived to see his invention become a household name. He died in 1888, still battling addiction and nearly penniless. He had sold his rights to Coca-Cola for around $1,750, barely a drop in the bucket compared to what the brand would become. And that's the bittersweet beginning of Coca-Cola, a story of a struggling inventor, a fateful recipe, and a business-savvy entrepreneur who saw what the original creator could not. The birth of Pepsi. While Coca-Cola was gaining ground in Atlanta, another pharmacist, this one from New Bern, North Carolina, was busy brewing up his own idea. His name was Caleb Bradham, and in the 1890s, he ran a local drugstore with a popular soda fountain. Like many pharmacists of his era, Bradham wasn't just selling medicine. He was experimenting with drinks that could refresh and energize his customers. In 1893, he created what he first called Brad's Drink. Not the catchiest name, but the recipe was solid. It combined sugar, water, caramel, nutmeg, cola nuts, and the all-important fizz from carbonated water. Customers loved it. Unlike Coca-Cola, which leaned into its medicinal tonic reputation, Bradham marketed his concoction as more of a delicious, uplifting refreshment. 5 years later, in 1898, Bradham renamed it Pepsi Cola, a name inspired by the digestive enzyme pepsin and the word cola for its cola nut flavoring. It sounded scientific, healthy even. In an age when people were always looking for cures to indigestion and fatigue, Pepsi promised to be a tasty solution. For a while, things looked promising. Bradham formally incorporated the Pepsi Cola Company in 1902. By 1904, he was bottling Pepsi, and by 1910, there were Pepsi bottlers in 24 states. The drink had momentum, and Bradham was ambitious. But then, disaster. During World War I, sugar prices skyrocketed because of shortages and high demand. Caleb Bradham, thinking prices would keep rising, bought massive amounts of sugar on credit. But when the war ended in 1918, supply surged and sugar prices plummeted. By 1920 to 1921, sugar was worth only a fraction of what Bradham had paid. His gamble backfired, and by 1923, Pepsi-Cola was bankrupt and left drowning in debt. Caleb Bradham, the man who dreamed of going toe-to-toe with Coca-Cola, lost his company and returned to running his small pharmacy. He died in 1934, long before Pepsi became a household name. Like Coca-Cola's John Pemberton, Bradham created the recipe but didn't reap the fortune. Still, his creation survived bankruptcy, reinvention, and rejection, and eventually became half of one of the fiercest rivalries in business history. Early rivalry, David versus Goliath. By the early 1900s, Coca-Cola had already turned itself into more than just a drink. Asa Candler's relentless marketing had turned Coke from a pharmacy curiosity into a national phenomenon. Candler understood something that would define the cola wars for the next century. A soft drink isn't just a drink, it's a lifestyle. So he threw Coke's logo on everything. Everywhere you went, you saw the flowing script logo. On calendars, wall clocks, store signs, serving trays, and even painted the logo on buildings. If there was a flat surface, Coke wanted its name on it. Candler wasn't just selling soda, he was engraving Coca-Cola into America's daily life. He handed out coupons for free drinks, making sure people got hooked on the taste. By the 1920s, the brand had spread far beyond Atlanta, turning into a global symbol of American culture. They had custom-designed soda fountains, glass bottles with their now iconic script logo, and even legal battles to protect the name. Coke was everywhere, and it was establishing itself as the American soft drink. Coca-Cola also had another big advantage: consistency. The product tasted the same no matter where you bought it. Same recipe, same script logo, same contour glass bottle that looked like it belonged in an art museum. Coke wasn't just selling sugar water, it was selling reliability, identity, and most importantly, trust. By the early 1900s, the cola landscape wasn't exactly balanced. Coca-Cola was soaring, while Pepsi was, well, barely hanging on. For Pepsi, things were not going well. Caleb Bradham had lost Pepsi-Cola Company to bankruptcy in 1923 after sugar prices plummeted, and the company couldn't pay its debts. Pepsi might have disappeared forever, but here's where the story gets interesting. For years after, Pepsi changed hands multiple times, going through a series of owners who each tried, and mostly failed, to revive it. Pepsi was so desperate that it actually offered to sell itself to Coca-Cola. That's right, Coca-Cola was offered the chance to buy Pepsi not once but twice in the 1930s, and turned it down both times. Talk about a missed opportunity. That decision would come back to haunt Coke. Finally, in 1938, businessman Charles Guth, who also ran the Loft Candy Company, managed to stabilize Pepsi. His big move was brilliant in its simplicity. The moment came when Pepsi finally stumbled onto a winning strategy. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, money was tight, people were counting pennies, and Coca-Cola was still selling its classic 6-ounce bottle for a nickel. Enter Pepsi with a bold move. While Coke was selling its 6-ounce bottle for a nickel, Pepsi decided to sell double the amount, 12 ounces, for the same price. In other words, twice the drink, same cost. During an era when every penny mattered, Pepsi suddenly looked like the smart, thrifty choice. Pepsi even made a catchy radio jingle about it, bragging about their twice as much for a nickel too. It was simple, repetitive, and stuck in people's heads. It worked, sales boomed, and suddenly Pepsi wasn't just surviving, it was suddenly the scrappy competitor Coke couldn't ignore. Coca-Cola wasn't amused. For decades, it had cultivated an image of quality, heritage, and being the real thing. To Coke executives, Pepsi's bargain pricing was cheap and undignified. But to millions of Americans pinching pennies, Pepsi was a godsend. That price war gave Pepsi its first real taste of victory in the cola wars. From there, Pepsi leaned hard into being the scrappy challenger brand. It didn't have Coca-Cola's history or deep cultural roots, but it had value, clever marketing, and a willingness to take risks. Over time, that scrappy underdog identity would evolve into Pepsi's trademark youthful branding, a direct contrast to Coke's classic image. As the rivalry heated up, their differences in branding became crystal clear. Coca-Cola leaned into tradition and wholesomeness. Their ads showed smiling families and wholesome Americana. Coke wanted to be your trusted friend, the drink you'd share at a family barbecue or with Santa Claus at Christmas. Even though Pepsi was finally standing on its own 2 feet, Coke wasn't going to lose sleep over it just yet. Coca-Cola had already woven itself into American life. During World War II, Coke made a deal with the U.S. government to supply soldiers with bottles of Coke, no matter where they were stationed. It wasn't just patriotism, it was genius marketing. Soldiers came home from the war associating Coke with comfort, nostalgia, and victory. Pepsi couldn't compete with that kind of emotional branding. So, in this round of David versus Goliath, Pepsi scored some scrappy points with its cheap, oversized bottles, but Coca-Cola was still very much the heavyweight champion. Coke was America's drink. Pepsi was still the underdog, clawing for recognition. Yet what's fascinating about rivalries is that underdogs have a habit of turning the tables, and Pepsi was about to find its secret weapon: youth. Because while Coca-Cola was busy being the safe, dependable choice of parents and grandparents, Pepsi realized there was an untapped market. The younger generation who wanted something fresh, exciting, and maybe a little rebellious. The stage was set. Coke was the establishment. Pepsi was the challenger. And soon, this wouldn't just be about cola. It would be about culture, identity, and who could win over America's heart. The Pepsi generation. By the time the 1960s rolled around, Pepsi had survived its near-death experiences and was finally ready to swing at Coca-Cola. But let's be honest, going head-to-head with Coke on tradition, heritage, or sheer brand loyalty was a losing game. Coke was already the drink of America's past. The bottle in your dad's hand at the ball game, the logo on Santa Claus, the thing Grandma poured over ice on the front porch. So Pepsi decided, why chase the past when you can own the future? Enter the Pepsi generation. This was one of the smartest pivots in advertising history. Instead of trying to beat Coke by being Coke, Pepsi began positioning itself as the choice for a new generation, the drink of young people. Their message was simple: Coke is your parents' soda. Pepsi is yours. Pepsi ads were upbeat, fashionable, and forward-looking. It was edgy, it was bold, and it resonated in an era when young people were questioning everything, from politics to music to fashion. The slogans, "For those who think young," which was then transitioned to "Come alive," "You're in the Pepsi generation," first appeared in the early 1960s. And it wasn't just a tagline, it was a cultural call to arms. The ads featured smiling, energetic young adults surfing, driving convertibles, and hanging out at beaches. Everyone looked cool, everyone looked modern, and everyone conveniently had a Pepsi in hand. This campaign tapped into a broader cultural shift. The 1960s weren't exactly about playing it safe. Rock and roll was booming, the civil rights movement was reshaping America, and the youth were the heartbeat of change. Pepsi attached itself to that energy and said, "We're not just a drink, we're the choice of a new generation." The contrast worked. While Coke maintained its dominance, Pepsi began carving out its own lane. Pepsi had shaken off its underdog image and was standing toe-to-toe with the giant. Coke still had more market share, but Pepsi had swagger, and the rivalry was starting to look less like David versus Goliath. Coca-Cola, meanwhile, stayed the course with its wholesome, family-friendly branding. Coke was about tradition, nostalgia, and comfort, Their ads showed families picnicking, soldiers drinking Coke overseas, or timeless holiday cheer. Which was fine. But it also made Coke look a little old, safe, predictable. And here's the thing about marketing. Perception is everything. Pepsi wasn't actually cooler than Coke. It just looked cooler. And that was enough to pull in the youth market. Suddenly, Pepsi wasn't just the cheaper soda. It was the soda that said, "I'm not my parents." By the 1970s, Pepsi doubled down on this strategy. They signed major celebrity endorsements, leaning into pop culture in a way Coke wasn't doing yet. Music stars, athletes, and actors were suddenly drinking Pepsi on TV. It gave the brand credibility with teenagers and young adults, and positioned it as the drink of energy, ambition, and possibility. Coke, of course, wasn't blind to this shift. They responded with campaigns like, "It's the real thing," and the legendary 1971 "I'd like to buy the world a Coke" commercial. An ad that basically said Coke wasn't just for your parents, it was for everyone, everywhere. It was global, universal, unifying. It was a strong comeback, but Pepsi had already carved out its niche. The Pepsi Generation campaign marked the moment when the cola wars officially escalated. This wasn't just two sodas competing on taste anymore, it was culture versus culture. Coke was tradition. Pepsi was rebellion. Coke was the establishment. Pepsi was the challenger. And for the first time, Coke's dominance didn't feel untouchable. If Coke was the king sitting comfortably on the throne, Pepsi had just lit a torch and yelled from the gates, "We're coming for you." And the next step in Pepsi's rebellion? Proving, in a very public way, that people actually preferred Pepsi over Coke. That moment would come in the form of a brilliant little stunt called the Pepsi Challenge. The Pepsi Challenge. By the mid-1970s, Pepsi had a clever marketing position, the drink of youth, energy, and the future. But there was still one nagging problem. No matter how cool Pepsi looked in ads, Coca-Cola was still the king of the soda aisle. Coke had the bigger share, the bigger reputation, and the bigger influence. Pepsi needed something bold, something that wouldn't just say Pepsi was better, but would prove it. Enter the Pepsi Challenge. In 1975, Pepsi rolled out one of the gutsiest marketing campaigns ever, the blind taste test. The idea was simple. Set up a table in a mall, airport, or busy street corner. Put two plain white cups on the table, one filled with Coca-Cola, the other with Pepsi. Ask people to take a sip of each, then pick which one they liked better. No logos, no labels, no bias. Just pure taste. The results? Over and over, people picked Pepsi. And Pepsi made sure the whole world saw it. The commercials practically gloated. Wide-eyed consumers would sip both cups, pause dramatically, and then point to the Pepsi. Cue the shocked reaction, the upbeat music, and the tagline, "More people prefer Pepsi." It was marketing genius. For decades, Coke had been untouchable, the unshakable king of cola. And now here was Pepsi showing actual people on camera saying they liked Pepsi better. It was a direct punch in the face to Coke's dominance. And the best part? Pepsi wasn't even lying. In blind taste tests, Pepsi often did win. Why? Because Pepsi is a little sweeter than Coke. That extra hit of sugar and citrus made Pepsi taste better in small sips. Of course, if you drank a whole can, many people still preferred Coke's smoother finish. But the tests weren't about drinking a full can. They were about first impressions. And in marketing, first impressions are everything. Coca-Cola, meanwhile, was rattled. For a company that had built its identity on being the real thing, it was humiliating to be told that in a blind test, people liked the other guy better. Coke scrambled to respond, running their own campaigns to reassure loyal drinkers that Coke was still king. But the damage was done. The Pepsi Challenge didn't just give Pepsi a win, it shifted the psychology of soda. Suddenly, drinking Pepsi wasn't just about taste. It was about siding with the bold challenger, the one who dared to take on the giant. It became a statement. I'm not falling for tradition. I'm choosing the better drink. The challenge also pushed Pepsi deeper into pop culture. By the late 1970s and early 80s, Pepsi was signing on celebrities and athletes left and right. They had commercials with Michael Jackson, Lionel Richie, and later Madonna and Britney Spears. Every time a star held a Pepsi can, it felt like Coke was being nudged further into the past. But here's where things take a twist. The Pepsi challenge didn't just shake Coke's confidence, it practically gave Coke an identity crisis. The big red giant, for the first time in its history, started to doubt itself. And that doubt would lead to one of the most infamous blunders in business history: New Coke. Yes, in an attempt to outdo Pepsi, Coca-Cola decided to change its sacred formula. Spoiler alert, it did not go well. The New Coke fiasco. By 1985, Coca-Cola was in a full-blown panic. The Pepsi challenge had hit them where it hurt, not just in sales but in ego. For decades, Coke had been the real thing, the undisputed king of sodas. But now, every time someone pointed at a white paper cup and said they preferred Pepsi, Coke's crown felt a little shakier. So the Coca-Cola executives did something drastic. They decided, if Pepsi tastes sweeter and people like it more in tests, let's just make Coke taste more like Pepsi. Yep. They actually changed the formula. The company spent millions on research and development. They ran taste tests with thousands of people. And just like the Pepsi challenge, those tests showed the new, sweeter formula was a hit. Internally, Coke felt confident. The data was clear. People liked the new taste. And so, on April 23, 1985, they rolled out a bombshell: New Coke. The old formula? Gone. The new formula? The future. Coca-Cola announced it with fanfare, commercials, and a slick PR campaign. They framed it as bold, innovative, and exactly what the people wanted. There was just one tiny problem: the people didn't actually want it. Almost immediately, the backlash began. Loyal Coke drinkers were furious. To them, Coca-Cola wasn't just a beverage. It was a cultural institution. It was the taste of childhood, of family cookouts, of victory parades. It was tradition in a bottle. And now, the company had yanked that away and replaced it with something that tasted like Pepsi. Consumers revolted. Angry letters poured in by the thousands. Some people started stockpiling cases of the original Coke like it was the end of the world. Protest groups formed with names like Old Cola Drinkers of America. Even celebrities and politicians chimed in, slamming the move. The media had a field day. Late-night hosts mocked Coca-Cola. News outlets covered the backlash as if it were a political scandal. One joke went, "What's next? They're going to change the recipe for Mom's apple pie?" It became painfully clear. Coca-Cola had underestimated just how much emotional weight people attached to their product. They thought they were selling a drink. What they were really selling was nostalgia. And nostalgia doesn't change recipes. After just 79 days of chaos, Coca-Cola caved. On July 11, 1985, the company held a press conference announcing the return of the original formula, now branded as Coca-Cola Classic. New Coke was still sold for a while, but it quickly faded into obscurity, remembered only as one of the biggest marketing blunders in history. Here's the irony: the whole disaster actually helped Coca-Cola in the long run. The backlash reminded everyone just how much they loved the original Coke. Sales of Coca-Cola Classic soared after its return, and brand loyalty was stronger than ever. What was meant to be a humiliating defeat turned into a reaffirmation of Coke's dominance. Meanwhile, Pepsi couldn't help but laugh. For years, they had positioned themselves as the daring challenger. And now, Coke had blinked. They had doubted themselves so much they literally changed their identity, and then had to admit they were wrong. For Pepsi, this was priceless. But Coca-Cola wasn't done fighting. They had learned a hard lesson. Don't mess with tradition. If Pepsi wanted to fight in the arena of celebrity endorsements and youth culture, fine. Coke would fight back with something even more powerful: timelessness, comfort, and branding that pulled at the heartstrings. The cola wars were about to move into a new stage, a stage where it wasn't just about taste, but about who could dominate pop culture. And in that battle, Pepsi was about to bring out its biggest weapon yet: Michael Jackson. Celebrities, Super Bowls, and music videos. If the 1970s and early 80s were about Pepsi proving it could stand toe-to-toe with Coke, then the late 80s and 90s were about Pepsi going all in on pop culture. And nothing screams pop culture louder than a celebrity with a soda can in hand. Pepsi figured this out early. Instead of just showing happy families at picnics or teenagers on surfboards, they started bringing in megastars. The idea was simple. If your idol drinks Pepsi, maybe you'll want to as well. And in 1984, Pepsi landed the biggest endorsement deal in advertising history: Michael Jackson. The King of Pop signed a $5 million deal with Pepsi, and the commercials were massive cultural events. They featured Jackson dancing to a reworked version of Billie Jean, now called Pepsi Generation. Kids weren't just drinking soda, they were drinking cool. Pepsi became less about cola and more about connecting yourself to a superstar. Of course, the Pepsi-Michael Jackson partnership also came with drama. During one commercial shoot, pyrotechnics went wrong, and Jackson's hair caught on fire, causing serious burns. Pepsi paid out a settlement and covered Jackson's medical bills, but the incident didn't stop the partnership. If anything, it kept Pepsi in the headlines even more, and Jackson was just the beginning. Over the next decade, Pepsi stacked its celebrity roster like it was building an all-star team. Cindy Crawford, Madonna, Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, Beyoncé, Pink, Spice Girls, all of them became Pepsi icons. By the early 2000s, Pepsi commercials looked more like music videos than ads. They weren't selling soda, they were selling star power. Coca-Cola, on the other hand, took a different route. They doubled down on being timeless. Instead of chasing trends, Coke leaned on emotional, feel-good branding with wholesome commercials. Think of the polar bear commercials that melted everyone's hearts, or the Christmas ads with Santa Claus holding a Coke. Images so iconic they're practically part of holiday tradition. Coke wasn't trying to be edgy. Coke was trying to be eternal. This split defined the cola wars for decades. Pepsi wanted to be flashy, trendy, and tied to whatever celebrity was hot that year. Coke wanted to be classic, familiar, and comforting. One was MTV. The other was a Norman Rockwell painting. The Super Bowl became another battleground. Pepsi made it their mission to own halftime shows, starting with huge celebrity performances. Coke stuck more with traditional commercials like Mean Joe Green tossing his jersey to a kid after drinking a Coke, ads that made people cry instead of dance. And here's the fascinating part: both strategies worked. Pepsi carved out an identity as the drink of choice for younger consumers who wanted to feel connected to pop culture. Coke stayed the safe, reliable drink that felt like it had always been there, because, well, it had. But there's a risk with being the trendy brand. Trends fade, celebrities get replaced. Pop stars who sell millions one year can become irrelevant the next. Coke, by focusing on timeless imagery, avoided that trap. Pepsi, on the other hand, sometimes found itself too tied to whatever was popular that moment, which worked great in the short term, but made it harder to build the same kind of long-lasting loyalty. Pepsi's celebrity strategy hit its peak when they decided to go all out for a Super Bowl ad that blended pop stars, nostalgia, and pure spectacle. In the early 2000s, Pepsi realized they had to connect with the rising millennial generation, young people who craved bold, fresh, and larger-than-life entertainment. So they staged an ad that looked more like a Hollywood blockbuster than a commercial. Britney Spears, Beyoncé, and Pink stormed into an ancient Roman Colosseum, dressed as gladiators ready to rewrite history. Enrique Iglesias played the villainous emperor, setting the stage for a showdown that no one would forget. But here's where Pepsi showed its genius. They didn't just target the younger crowd, they threw a bone to the older generation too. Midway through the ad, the Gladiators broke into a cover of Queen's We Will Rock You, with none other than Roger Taylor and Brian May themselves making appearances on the drum as they sat in the Colosseum. Suddenly, It wasn't just a commercial for teens, it was an intergenerational spectacle. Parents who grew up with Queen and kids who idolized Britney, Beyoncé, and Pink could enjoy the moment side by side. Pepsi wasn't selling a drink. They were selling a cultural bridge. The impact was massive. People weren't just talking about Pepsi, they were talking about that ad. It blurred the lines between advertising and entertainment, proving that commercials could be just as memorable as the halftime show itself. The visuals, the music, and the star power made it one of the most celebrated ads in Super Bowl history. And because it tapped into multiple generations, it wasn't limited to just one demographic. Pepsi managed to make itself relevant to everyone watching. This was the power of Pepsi's celebrity strategy at its finest. They had always been good at aligning themselves with youth culture, but this ad showed they could unite generations under one roof, or in this case, one stadium. By mixing millennial icons with timeless legends, Pepsi created a moment that people actually wanted to rewatch, share, and talk about for years. It was proof that when you combine the right stars with the right cultural touchpoints, you don't just sell soda, you make history. Meanwhile, Coke quietly stayed the steady giant. Their polar bears didn't sing, dance, or moonwalk, but they stuck in people's hearts year after year. It was the difference between chasing the spotlight and owning the stage forever. So while Pepsi was partying with pop stars, Coke was cozying up with your childhood memories. Both approaches worked in their own way. Modern Cola Wars. By the time the 2010s rolled around, the Cola Wars had shifted battlefields. Forget corner stores and TV commercials. This fight was moving online. Suddenly, it wasn't just about who had the flashiest Super Bowl ad. It was about who could win on Twitter, dominate Instagram, and survive the rise of a generation that was starting to side-eye soda altogether. See, in the 1980s and 90s, drinking Coke or Pepsi was cool. It meant you were part of the in-crowd fast forward to the 2010s, and suddenly the same crowd was clutching kale smoothies and talking about clean eating. Not exactly soda-friendly territory. Obesity rates were climbing, parents were worried about sugar, and suddenly, both companies found themselves the villains in a global health narrative. That's when the Cola Wars went from a loud, flashy marketing fight to a quieter, more strategic survival game. Coca-Cola, with its iconic red branding and century-old reputation, leaned heavily on nostalgia. They doubled down on reminding people of happy moments, family gatherings, and of course, Christmas. Seriously, Coca-Cola has basically trademarked Santa Claus at this point. Good luck separating the two in your head. They also started expanding into bottled water, teas, and low-calorie alternatives like Coke Zero and Diet Coke with more fashionable branding. Pepsi, on the other hand, kept doing what it does best, chasing youth culture. They went all in on celebrity partnerships. Think Cardi B, Doja Cat, Megan Thee Stallion, and all the footballers you have seen in Pepsi ads like Messi, Drogba, Henry, Beckham, to name a few, and became the go-to sponsor for pop culture moments like the Super Bowl halftime show. Pepsi knew it couldn't beat Coke in nostalgia, so instead it tried to own the now. The message was basically, Coke is your grandma's drink, but Pepsi is yours. But here's the kicker. While the companies were fighting each other, another threat was sneaking in through the back door. Energy drinks like Red Bull and Monster were exploding in popularity, especially among younger consumers who wanted more caffeine kick than a can of cola could ever deliver. And then came bottled water. Yep, plain old water. By the late 2000s, bottled water outsold soda in the US. That's like losing a popularity contest to the most boring kid in school. Both Coke and Pepsi had to adapt. Coca-Cola launched Smart Water and Vitamin Water, and Pepsi leaned into Gatorade and its portfolio of healthier-sounding drinks. The rivalry was no longer about just cola. It became a fight for shelf space in every category of beverage. Tea, coffee, energy, sparkling water, you name it, they were fighting over it. And then came social media wars. Coke kept its wholesome, heartwarming tone, sharing polar bears, happiness slogans, and emotional stories. Pepsi tried to go viral with edgier campaigns, though not always successfully. Remember the Kendall Jenner protest ad? Yeah, Pepsi would probably rather you didn't. Meanwhile, fans themselves created free marketing by turning Coke versus Pepsi debates into memes, YouTube taste tests, and endless Twitter threads. Today, the cola wars aren't about which tastes better. Most people agree they can barely tell the difference blindfolded. It's about branding, cultural identity, and whether you prefer your drink with a side of nostalgia or a slice of pop culture relevance. The rivalry is less explosive than in the 80s, but it's still simmering. Like a can of soda that's been shaken, waiting to burst open again when you least expect it. The modern cola wars show us something important. The feud isn't just about soda anymore, it's about adaptability. Both Coke and Pepsi are less interested in destroying each other and more focused on making sure they don't get left behind in a world that suddenly prefers kombucha and oat milk lattes. Still, one thing hasn't changed. The moment you sit down at a restaurant and the server asks, "Is Pepsi okay?" you know exactly which side has the upper hand. Legacy of the cola wars. When you step back from the fizz, sugar, and billion-dollar ad budgets, the cola wars are more than just a fight over soda. They're a blueprint for modern marketing, a case study in consumer psychology, and, let's be honest, a bit of a cultural circus. Coke and Pepsi didn't just sell drinks, they sold identities. They taught us that branding isn't just about what's in the bottle, but about what that bottle represents. Think about it. Coca-Cola positioned itself as timeless, classic, and comforting, like your reliable friend who always shows up in a red sweater at Christmas. Pepsi, on the other hand, branded itself as rebellious, youthful, and edgy, the cool kid who brings a boombox to the party. Both drinks taste similar, some would argue almost identical, but their marketing built entire personalities. People weren't just buying soda, they were buying into a tribe. The cola wars also exposed just how powerful emotions are in business. Remember New Coke? Logically, people should have been fine with a slightly sweeter formula. But they weren't. Why? Because Coke wasn't just a beverage. It was tied to people's childhoods, their family dinners, their sense of tradition. Messing with it was like someone remixing your grandma's secret recipe and insisting it was better. Consumers revolted because Coke didn't just change a drink, it tampered with memories. Another legacy, the sheer scale of competition. Coke and Pepsi spent decades outspending each other in ads, sponsorships, and promotions. Super Bowl commercials turned into battlegrounds. Pop stars became brand warriors. And while these companies were at war, the rest of the world learned how to play the game. Today, tech giants like Apple and Samsung, McDonald's and Burger King, even Nike and Adidas, all use playbooks that Coke and Pepsi wrote. It's not enough to have a product. You need a personality, a movement, a lifestyle. But there's a twist. The cola wars didn't end with a clear winner. Coke still leads in global soda sales, but Pepsi diversified smartly into snacks, controlling massive brands like Doritos, Cheetos, and Lay's. In many ways, they stopped fighting over just soda and started competing over everything we consume. And let's face it, while Coke might dominate your cup, Pepsi probably dominates your snack bowl. There's also the health factor. As consumers shifted toward bottled water, energy drinks, and healthier options, both companies had to adapt. Suddenly, being the fun soda wasn't enough. Coke and Pepsi started buying water brands, tea companies, even kombucha. Why? Because the war isn't really about cola anymore. It's about staying relevant. The battlefield has changed, but the rivalry still fuels innovation. In pop culture, the cola wars left behind some of the most iconic marketing moments of all time. Michael Jackson dancing for Pepsi, Coca-Cola's Hilltop commercial where people sang about buying the world a Coke, and Super Bowl ads that people still rank among the greatest. These weren't just ads, they became cultural events. So, what's the big lesson? The cola wars proved that competition, even cutthroat competition, can actually be good for us, the consumers. It forced both brands to innovate, stay creative, and give us better deals and flashier halftime shows. It also showed that, in the end, it's not always about the product. It's about the story you tell. Coke versus Pepsi wasn't really about cola. It was about identity, nostalgia, rebellion, and belonging. And whether you're sipping a Coke, a Pepsi, or just plain water, You're part of a story that shaped modern business. The Cola Wars may have cooled off, but their legacy? That's eternal.